Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Charlotte Gibson, president of Charlottesville Now, and I'm delighted to have you all join us tonight to welcome Ilyse Hogue, author of the compelling book, The Lie That Binds. But before I introduce our speaker, we want to offer some actions you can immediately take around the topic of tonight's meeting. So here are 3 things that you can do right away for reproductive rights. First, you can learn more by buying the book and sharing the podcast. And you can join NARAL's action campaigns. They have a number of reproductive rights action campaigns on their website that you could participate in. Or you could take direct action by donating to the Blue Ridge Abortion Fund, which is a local nonprofit that originated as a project of Charlottesville Now and has now been active for 30 years and did over, I think, 1,000, helped people, over 1,000 people with abortions last year. All of these links are going to be in the chat. As for long-term solutions, you can help flip the U.S. Senate. The feminist majority and the National Organization for Women are working together on a campaign to flip control of the Senate. 4 seats are needed for the majority, 3 if Democrats win the presidency. Here's hoping. The targeted states to flip are Arizona, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, Montana, North Carolina, and South Carolina. You can help by donating or volunteering. You can find links to the campaigns of the candidates in these states in the chat. Also, if you own a printer, you can help by writing letters to infrequent voters in these states through Vote Forward. That link is also going to be included in the chat. Sign up to download form letters that you print at home, then add your own personal note and mail out. Act fast though, because the letters are to be mailed this Saturday, October 17th. And at the end of our program tonight, our VP for Action, Kathy Falzer, will share some additional volunteer opportunities in the local Charlottesville area. Of course, the easiest direct action to take right now is voting. Vote and make sure your family and friends vote in this election, which is clearly the most consequential so far of our lifetimes. In Virginia, you can vote early in person through October. You can apply for mail-in ballot by 5 p.m. October 23rd. You can vote by mail or put your mail-in ballot in a drop box. And mail-in ballots must be postmarked by November 3rd and received by noon on November 6th to count. Vote in person at your polling place on November 3rd from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. You can find all the voter information you need at the Virginia Department of Elections, which will also be in the chat. The link will be in the chat. And now, on to our program for this evening and our wonderful speaker. We will have a question and answer session at the end of her remarks, so please type your questions into the chat. Ilyse Hogue is an expert grassroots organizer for social justice issues, including human rights, climate change, and media reform, as well as reproductive rights. Prior to taking the helm as president of NARAL Pro-Choice America in 2013, Ms. Hogue was a leader at other progressive organizations, including Move On, Friends of Democracy, Rainforest Action Network, and Media Matters for America. Under her leadership, NARAL tripled its membership to 2.5 million and became an organizing powerhouse, advancing state and federal legislation to protect and expand abortion access and fighting an unprecedented wave of anti-abortion bans at the state level. While anti-choice lawmakers were creating restrictions meant to legislate abortion out of existence, Hogue boldly pushed the national conversation around reproductive freedom. She made history in 2016 by sharing her own abortion story during the Democratic National Convention, explaining it's not as simple as bad girls get abortions and good girls have families. We are the same women at different times in our lives, each making decisions that are best for us. She has helped connect the dots between reproductive rights, economic security, and our nation's prosperity. Ilyse Hogue is a frequent guest on CNN, MSNBC, and NPR, and her commentary has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, HuffPost, The Nation, Cosmopolitan, and Elle. It is an honor to have Ilyse Hogue join us tonight to discuss her book, The Lie That Binds, a compelling read that details the intentional efforts to take abortion from non-political issue to weapon and battle cry used by far-right conservatives to move a regressive policy agenda. Over to you, Ilyse. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and a special shout out to Nancy Damon, who is a good friend and like a second mom to me. So thank you, Nancy, for helping to organize and for being here. And thanks to all of you. I took over NARAL almost 8 years ago, and when I did, I understood from the moment I accepted the position that I stand on the shoulder of giants, many named and countless unnamed, who waged this battle long before I was born and, you know, through my formative years, so that I could, in fact, have the story of my own decision to terminate a pregnancy in a relatively easy and compassionate way, which was not the case prior to efforts to legalize abortion in this country, and for far too many not the case now. So I want to thank all of you, many of whom have been involved in this struggle for longer than I have. You know, I came to NARAL with a really basic hypothesis, which is, as a girl who grew up in Texas, fourth generation Texan, having lived all over the country and in a couple different places around the world, that there was this idea that this medical procedure that, from my experience, you know, was mostly accepted and supported by the vast majority of people, had become such a hot button issue that was central to all of the politics that we were experiencing. And I really had a question about how we could have majority support for the idea that individuals should be in the driver's seat of our own reproductive destinies, our own bodies, and therefore our own lives, and yet be losing. And I came in 2013, so this was still the Obama and Biden years, but I am from Texas. And in many ways, we were the canary in the coal mine about what erosion of these rights would actually look like, feel like, you know, at broad scale, because it was already happening in Texas. So I wanted to understand what it meant to have majority support for something that was being trodden on. And then as we were kind of doing that and piecing together the opposition and the central role that the opposition, that abortion opponents had taken within the GOP, which was not always the case, 2016 happened, and we were watching, you know, a hotly contested primary on the Republican side. And I started to get questions as it became clear that Donald Trump was the darling of a radical right with whom he seemingly shared almost no values or, you know, principles with. You know, why was what people thought of as the religious right getting in bed with this thrice married serial sexual predator reality show host who seemed to be the antithesis of everything that they stood for? And then to compound matters, we started to see that as everyone believed he was going to lose, he was wheeling and dealing and making transactions with the radical right that allowed them to fill the vacuum of the Republican Party, who had started to pull resources from what they saw as a failing campaign that was weighing on their down ticket candidates, and get him over the finish line. And in answering those questions, we felt like we had to contextualize what happened in 2016, why we missed it, in a mistold and misunderstood history of the radical right and the role that abortion played in mobilizing the radical right. And that brought us to putting all of our research together into the book, which is called The Lie That Binds. And one of the goals of the book was to actually expose the central lie that abortion, opposition to abortion, hostility to abortion was always central to the organizing theory of the radical right, or that they ever were, or are now driven by outrage, moral or otherwise, to outcomes of individual pregnancy. Nothing could be further from the truth when you look at the actual history, not the history they tell. In fact, the radical right was mobilized to public or political engagement from a sort of place of not, feeling like the political realm was tainted. In the late 60s, first invoking a term that we heard a lot today, if you watch the hearings, about, quote, religious liberty, to fight school desegregation. They were arguing, Jerry Falwell and a man by the name of Paul Weyrich, who was responsible for building a lot of the infrastructure of the radical right, were arguing that it was their religious right not to send their kids to school with Black kids. They lost that fight. And I'm always careful to say, because it's important and true, that that's not because we've solved racism or structural inequities in the school, but because the civil rights movement made advances, and desegregation in schools became the law of the land. And then they kind of converged with a woman I'm sure you're all familiar with, named Phyllis Schlafly, who was fighting gender equity through the defeat of the ERA. All of this happened with very little mention of abortion at all. In fact, one of the leading fundamentalist evangelicals at the time Roe v. Wade came down in 1973, actually put out a statement saying, yeah, you know what, what's good for the mom is good for the family. This is not really our business. And as late as 1976, the Convention on Southern Baptists affirmed the rights in Roe. So what happened is that they had won on the ERA, they had lost on school desegregation, and they were looking for a new issue around which they could organize. And they took what was really not a partisan issue, not even much of a talked about issue outside of the feminist movement of abortion, and said, you know what, that sounds pretty good. And they were able to use that as the tip of the spear for what really was an agenda about maintaining control for a very small number of people against the backdrop of a changing society, and that therein lies not just the central lie that they have been able to tell for so long, but also an explanation for how you have both a president who has overtly reunited white supremacists with your traditional sort of radical right, as we think of as the anti-choice movement, with what we call men's rights advocates, which are just like the new modern term for your old-fashioned misogynists who are threatened by women's power in society. And this is something that we're all living under. It's been on full display over the last couple days in this Supreme Court battle, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. But part of why we wrote the book was because we believe that unless we believe knowledge is power, and that shared analysis makes us better strategists at the end of the day in fighting the threats that are in front of us. And that if we accepted their revisionist history as fact, it was like fighting with our hands tied behind our back, essentially. And one of the things that I always say, and then I want to say a couple things about, what NARAL is doing now. there was a certain level of brilliance in them picking abortion as an issue. And that brilliance was not opposition to abortion. The majority of Americans believe in legal access to abortion. They did pre-Roe, they did in the 70s post-Roe, and they in fact do today. Their brilliance was in the idea that this issue was so uncomfortable for people to talk about because it was stigmatized. And we have to unpack that even more, because I always say abortion is a medical procedure. It's hard to stigmatize a medical procedure. What they really were tapping into were deep-seated cultural stereotypes about women who have sex, women who have sex outside of the desire to reproduce, women who would then maybe become pregnant by having that sex and be so selfish as to not actually want to carry that pregnancy to term. And then you add a racial overlay to that, and all of the tropes that were happening through the 70s and certainly through the 80s that Reagan perpetuated about irresponsible women, read Black women, welfare queens, too many babies, right? And what they banked on was that we would be too uncomfortable to have the conversation. And by we, I don't necessarily mean the people on this call who I suspect were always on the front lines of having this conversation, but that as a culture, we were not actually prepared to have an open conversation about issues that are deeply uncomfortable to talk about: sex, gender, race. And that worked for them for a really long time. And the reason that I point to that is because there's a theme that runs through the book, for those of you who are have read it or listened to the podcast, that they banked on our silence and we gave it to them, right? And that became a vehicle that allowed for them to move an agenda that was really grounded in control, but that started with reproductive oppression. And the consequences have been immense. And they have been immense in the restriction of abortion to women, particularly women who are not financially well off, Black and brown women, rural women. But they have had knock-on effects that are quite devastating beyond what we even usually talk about in this realm, including silence, not silence, but the same people who are restricting abortion in some of these agencies being responsible for family separation, right? Laws that have passed in states, and this is a true story, like a woman in Alabama in 2019, a pregnant woman who was shot in the stomach and put on trial for manslaughter of her own fetus for being shot in the stomach. These are really, really fundamental questions about women's place in society that we are now engaging in a conversation about with all the cards on the table, that we are breaking the silence, but that is so much a part of NARAL's theory of change and why we wrote the book and did the podcast, because it is not enough, although it's good and important to tell your own abortion story like I did. I believe in that if you want to. I don't believe in coercing people to have to tell those stories. But what we need to do is go a step further and talk about the values that are on trial here, the values of freedom versus control, the inherent misogyny and racism that is tied up in reproductive oppression that is not starting now, but has a really sinister history throughout the founding of what we now know as the United States of America. And when we break that silence, and NARAL does an enormous amount of training with our members who do peer-to-peer, that is the cutest kitten, Toby, who engage in peer-to-peer voter contact, it's important to do so through what we call courageous conversations, because it is important to remember these are still really uncomfortable conversations around many dinner tables or town halls or coffee circles. And so we train our members in courageous conversations. We train our members as well as candidates in spotting and combating disinformation, particularly what we call medical disinformation around abortion. You've heard a lot of that through the hearings. And that is part and parcel of how we actually run our not just culture shift programs, but our voter contact programs that will amount to the largest electoral program that NARAL has ever run in service of winning back the White House taking back the Senate, but also flipping state legislatures where so much of the damage is being done. And we do all of that to be in position to move legislation that actually not just protects, but expands reproductive access for everybody in this country who needs it. So that's a little bit of the background of what we're doing. We are active in all 50 states, but we are in all of the battleground states this time around. We are doing that voter contact. We are doing the candidate communications. And we are really making the case that when you stand up for the fundamental freedom of abortion rights, you are not only making sure that individuals are in the driver's seat of their own reproductive destiny, although I always say that would be enough if we were doing that, but in fact, we are actually asserting that we should live in a country where public policy is based on science and facts and good health outcomes, that we are making the case for a country where democracy and the majority of people's will gets enacted through politics and policy. And in fact, that we are shifting from defense to offense and really starting to interrogate the Republicans who are carrying this extraordinarily extreme agenda now as part and parcel of what the GOP platform is, and holding them accountable for that. So I'm going to stop there, and I was asked to just read a little bit of the book, and I want to read a passage that actually talks about them choosing abortion as an issue and why they did that and what that means. And I will just give one last caveat, which will probably ring familiar to some of you. Our research demonstrated, and we write about this a bit in the book, as they were casting about for a new issue, you could sense that on the, among the people having this conversation, what they really wanted to go after was birth control. Abortion being legal was like, not only basically non-controversial, but had minimal effect. It had maximum effect for an individual that needed abortion access. There was no question. But what the legalization of birth control for unmarried women had done in 1972 was create conditions where women could enter the workplace and stay because they were in more control of their own reproductive destiny. And what happened? You guys, many of you were there. Women started challenging men for access to the C-suite, pay equity. Oh my God, workplaces free of sexual harassment. Can you imagine? And that was having far more wide-reaching effects and challenging the hegemonic grip that men had enjoyed over economic systems as well as family systems for a very long time. But they thought that birth control would be a little bit of a bridge too far because people really liked it. And so they settled on abortion. But every time someone says to me, it's so shocking to them when someone who claims to be anti-abortion is also anti-contraception, because if you want to reduce the number of unintended pregnancies, you're going to expand birth control access. But in fact, that is part and parcel of the same control ideology that got us to where we are today. So I will read. I'm going to have to put my glasses on. People like Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell have always drawn political benefit from stoking racial animus to sow cultural discord. This cynical exploitation never stopped, but efforts became more coded in the 1970s as the successes of the civil rights movement showed quickly growing support for at least the theory of racial equality. So when the movement architects saw Phyllis Schlafly's accomplishments, they understood it as a ripe opportunity to add gender concerns to their efforts to defend the preservation of white patriarchal systems of control, or as they called it, the natural family. Schlafly's mastery at using identity politics provided a blueprint for the future of the new radical right. Maxwell and Shields underscored her influence in their book, The Long Southern Strategy. The politicization of these Southern white conservative and more often than not religious women in opposition to second wave feminism resuscitated and kept the GOP strategy alive. The cult of Southern white womanhood had primed this audience for generations. Thus, the anti-feminism rallying cry became as successful as the well-known dog whistles of race and religion. In fact, it was a bridge between the two. Schlafly's work was proof of concept. The evangelicals that Wyrick and Falwell had managed to activate were sensitive to more than just a loss of white supremacy. Wyrick and Falwell were convinced that at a moment when civil rights leaders were making advances and overtly racist appeals were losing their power, they could soft pedal their racism and persuade more Americans to fear the impact of giving freedom and power to women. Since racism and misogyny have always been tangled in American society, finding the right balance that kept just enough women on board was key to success. And that is where adapting messaging to appeal to fundamentalist religion came in. As Maxwell and Shields wrote, the Southern white way of life is not based solely on white superiority. Rather, it is best viewed as a triptych, with religious fundamentalism and patriarchy standing as separate hinged panels that can be folded inward, bent to cover or reinforce white supremacy throughout much of the region's history. As the moral majority was gaining steam in the late 70s, other leaders of the radical right caught the wave and set about building their own women's auxiliary. Moral Majority board member Tim LaHaye, who would later become something of a cult sensation as the author of the apocalyptic Christian series Left Behind, encouraged his wife Beverly to launch a complementary effort targeting women. In 1978, Beverly founded Concerned Women for America, an organization that still exists today. By that time, President Jimmy Carter had officially enacted new IRS rules to strip segregation academies of their tax-exempt status for good, capping the decade-long legal and political battle. The age of government-sanctioned segregation was supposed to be over, although the struggle for equality in schools continues to this day. Schlafly's campaign had effectively defeated the ERA by the 1979 deadline for ratification. The architects of the radical right found themselves in a conundrum. They knew they could energize a coalition of millions by stoking fear of cultural change and lost privilege, but their pet issues were losing relevance. They needed a new focus, a hot-button cultural issue that could channel social conservatism into real political allegiance. They needed an issue that was hot enough to resonate with an energized base, but not too hot that it would burn the Republican Party. In the late 70s, Wyrick joined a conference call for evangelical leaders to debate what could replace segregation as their focus for the next rallying cry of their new movement. A number of ideas were batted about, but none of them were just right. They probed for a hook that triggered a powerful emotional reaction against the cultural changes underway, something that tapped into the deep wells of racism or misogyny without coming off to the public as obviously racist or misogynistic. They wanted to bake their cake and eat it too. Finally, someone on the end of one of the lines made a fateful suggestion. How about abortion? That singular voice forever changed the landscape of American politics. So that sort of was the moment that they chose abortion. And then we write later about how they found Reagan to be the first major party nominee for presidency to actually carry that anti-abortion message through to the big stage. But one of the things that I always try to do to bring these threads together is remind people that Phyllis Schlafly, who lived to see the outcome of the 2016 election, was nonetheless a very, very early endorser of Donald Trump, long before many others, and over the protestations of many on the Eagle Forum board, including her own daughter, Anne, who ended up resigning from the board. Because remember, there were true believers like Ted Cruz still in the race. And when Phyllis Schlafly chose to endorse Trump, she did a very long sit-down interview with Breitbart News. And in this long, long interview, the word abortion never came up once. But what she did speak about in her support of Trump was not wanting the immigration that she felt was sweeping the country to mean that kids were gonna have to go to school with non-English speaking kids of immigrants who had no place in this country. And so to me, that was full circle from where they started in the late 60s fighting school desegregation. And also just a reminder that these are one and the same fight, and abortion is the tip of the spear for oppression, repression, and ending the advances of vulnerable populations that have fought for decades for equity and equality. So I'll stop there, and we can have a great discussion, I hope. Should I go to the chat? I see some questions already in the chat. Would that work for folks?
I see something from Nancy Damon. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
My video going again. Okay.
Yeah. So Nancy, I'll read your question out loud. So
Nancy says pro-choice is stereotyped as a cause for middle-class white women. How is NARAL working with other organizations of all women?
yeah, it's a great question. And we work in a broad coalition, and I want to get to that in a minute. But one of the things that we learned from working within the reproductive justice movement with reproductive justice leaders, which is a movement defined as founded by women of color for women of color who felt shut out in the 90s and the early aughts by historically white-led organizations from the conversation, a more fulsome conversation about reproductive oppression, is that the term pro-choice really doesn't work for them. Because what it doesn't acknowledge is that for many women, there has never been a choice. And there has never been a choice to access abortion since Hyde was put into place in 1976, shortly after Roe made abortion legal. But there is also not the same choices about parenting that we have. And what the reproductive justice leaders and Lens has taught us is that we have to embrace a more fulsome agenda around what it means to not only make sure that people have the tools in their hands to prevent unintended pregnancy, to terminate a pregnancy that they are not prepared to carry to term, but also to parent safely in this country, right? So we both work across movements, and I would say with the reproductive justice movement, but increasingly with the racial justice movement. We say that you cannot have reproductive freedom without freedom from tyranny and oppression. And so we are in active coalition with the Movement for Black Lives around their signature piece of legislation, the Breathe Act, to make sure that tyranny and oppression is something that we are deeply engaged in solidarity work around. But some of what you're asking about, Nancy, is changing our language and the way that we actually think about taking a more intersectional approach to the issue. So we are much, when we work in state-based coalitions, for example, we worked very hard in 2018, as I'm sure many of you all did, to make sure that Stacey Abrams could become the next governor of Georgia. That election was stolen. And two things that were really important for us to work authentically in community across race and class was to make sure that we were working as hard to highlight the voter suppression and the complete abdication of responsibility in that state by Republican leadership of record numbers of maternal mortality and the Black community as we were fighting the abortion ban. So it has definitely been a process for us to be able to authentically engage, acknowledge the history and the harms that the white-led movement has had by not centering the voices of those most affected. And also, I always say, because it's really important, that process is a journey, not a destination. It is a daily discipline. We are constantly listening to our diversifying members, our diversifying staff. We now offer translation services because we were working in a lot of non-English speaking communities. But even when we do that, even when NARAL goes into non-English speaking communities, we make sure that we are doing so at the invitation of the communities. And what we are not doing, because this is really important for legacy organizations, is undercutting the work of reproductive justice or racial justice organizations where community leadership is already there, right? And so that's been really, really important for us and has to be a lens moving forward because, you know, I'll tell two brief anecdotes from the book. And my good friend and mentor, Loretta Ross, who is one of the founders of the reproductive justice movement, she founded an organization called Sister Song, based in Georgia, now run by an amazing leader named Monica Simpson. You know, she always says, do this solidarity work hopefully because you care about everyone, but also because it's the only way to win. Right. So the book, if you read the foreword, is dedicated to Loretta because she, in fact, challenged us to write the book because she said too many people, particularly that you have an audience with, don't understand the historic racist underpinnings of this movement. And there is absolutely no way for us to strategically advance our cause unless we're authentically engaging in our past. And so, you know, two things in the book that I often use as examples of that were really like aha moments for me and doing the research. One is, you guys will remember in 2012, there was a guy running for Senate in Missouri against Claire McCaskill, and he was actually winning, who his name was Todd Aiken. And he said something on a local radio interview that women don't need abortion in the case of rape because if it is a legitimate rape, the body has a way of shutting that whole thing down. We call that medical disinformation. It is junk science. People can get pregnant from rape. That is a long established fact. And we traced that. We were like, where did that come from? We treated him in 2012 as though it was an outlier. He was an outlier. He was sort of a crazy fringe guy. He went on to lose the election, obviously. He was not an outlier. At the exact same time, there were 213 members of the Republican Congress, including Paul Ryan, who had signed on to a bill that actually specified forcible rape, which is just another word, you know, for legitimate rape. And so we thought, well, that's weird. How did that become so normalized and mainstream? And we went back and we looked at the transcripts of the hearings, the congressional hearings about the Hyde Amendment. And in fact, this was a live debate during the Hyde Amendment. And it was it was a piece of medical disinformation that led to barring exceptions from the Hyde Amendment. And it does two things, right? It basically promotes junk science, but it also says women are not to be trusted, right? And they in fact said in the hearings, if you actually allow this, women will cry rape to be able to get abortion after the fact. So we didn't actually stop there. We were like, well, it had to come from somewhere. And what we actually found was that there was a pamphlet that was funded by Paul Weyrich, who we talked about, in 1972 that had this sort of obscure piece at the time of medical disinformation. Paul Weyrich was of German descent, and a lot of his funding to build the right-wing infrastructure came from the Coors family, who, as everybody acknowledges now, were Nazi sympathizers, if not actual Nazis themselves. And in fact, the research has shown that that specific piece of disinformation came from medical experiments, non-medical, I shouldn't use the term medical, experiments on concentration camp inmates in Auschwitz. That is the origin of that medical disinformation. And the reason that I say that is because to me, it so exemplifies how white supremacy is tied up with reproductive oppression and disinformation. And the other thing I talk about that's really important is in 2017, a little known Trump-Pence appointee at HHS sort of had a moment of infamy when he became the face of an administration policy that was holding an undocumented woman against her will in an ICE facility in Texas, my home state again, who wanted an abortion, right? And there was a robust conversation about that. She actually ended up getting the service. The circuit court in DC ruled, Kavanaugh dissented. That is what put him on the short list for the Supreme Court. And we kind of know that story, but what doesn't get told is the flip side of that story, which is what Scott Lloyd was spending all of his time doing and directing his staff to spend all his time doing was monitoring the periods of young women in his supposed care, right? Preventing them from getting abortions, flying around on taxpayer dollars to actually berate them for asking to terminate pregnancies. And what he wasn't doing, and lots of civil servants actually came forward and said this, he was tracking periods. He was not tracking families that were separated. He was not providing beds for children in his care. And so these things are so tied up together. You cannot actually talk about abortion access or lack thereof, without actually acknowledging the deep racism and the deep need for control over others who these people believe they should have dominion over, without being authentic to the story.
I'd like to remind everybody to put questions, any questions you have, in the chat. Kabi noted in the chat, and this is a good reminder, that abortion funds help everyone in the moment when they have a need, and literally anyone who is in need can get access. It equalizes when women who have money can obviously access abortions more easily, but women who don't can't, and this is a great equalizer. So people can contribute to abortion funds. Karen, our collective memories are so short now, even those of us who lived through that time can't make headway with others about this issue. Yes, that probably is a good question. I could turn that into a question. You've done this a lot, Ilyse, so how do you make headway with people talking about this issue? I think it's a real challenge.
So we talk about this in two ways, and we've actually seen, well, three ways. We've actually seen a lot of strides. We have done really, really deep work on what we call emotional listening. And let's say that there are sort of three broad categories of people. One are probably the people on this call. I love that Karen is saying, I'm pro-abortion, right? Like there is nothing wrong with it. Like it is a Catholic Pollitt wrote pro, right? Like it's a social good. That, you know, I would call us the base, no qualms, no equivocation. Really hardcore people who are just absolutely anti-abortion, and then the people in the middle, right? So let's take the anti-people first. From an electoral perspective, not only don't we need those people, but we're never going to get them for all the reasons that I'm saying, right? Like the reason that the Federalist Society, who is this sort of institution that advances these right-wing judges, Amy Coney Barrett comes out of the Federalist Society, they actually used hostility towards Roe, hostility towards the idea of bodily autonomy and access to abortion as a litmus test for their aspiring judges, because it happened to map perfectly on hostility to almost everything else that had to do with social progress, right? And that the reason that I say that is because I think sometimes we spend so much time thinking about how can I convince the hardcore, when the reality is the hardcore is never going to vote Democratic for about 1,000 reasons beyond abortion. Then you have the middle. And I think that's where the really interesting part comes in, and that's where we focused our emotional listening. And what we have found is that when we actually go back to basic, when we do the courageous conversations, when we call out the disinformation, but when we actually frame this in terms of values, right? When we actually say, I understand, like you have all of these personal feelings, everybody has personal feelings, but this really at the end of the day is a question of who in our society has the freedom to determine the outcomes that are best for our own family versus the control that politicians are trying to exert that know nothing about our lives. We actually win those people. We actually win those people. And that's where you get to a fact that a plurality, this is where pro-choice and pro-life don't serve us at all. A plurality of people who self-identify as pro-life actually believe in legal access to abortion for lots of reasons, because they know that harm comes if you criminalize abortion, and they don't believe in that, because they don't want politicians making decisions, or simply because they understand that compassion is a core value that we share for our neighbors who are facing their own circumstances and need to make their own decisions. And then you can take it a step further, because one of the things we give up when we fall prey to the silence of this is calling out how extreme the GOP has gotten on this. And what we have found in having these courageous conversations is, you know, you sort of create common affinity by exhibiting compassion, empathy, what we call safety and affiliation, like reminding people that the majority of people land where we are, which is like individual decision making is actually best for outcomes for women, best for outcomes for family. But that when you go one step past that and you say, well, actually, the GOP position now, it is in their party platform, is to criminalize all abortion with no exceptions. And what does that mean? What does that look like? We're seeing that in some states, right? We're actually seeing investigation of miscarriages. We're seeing people, like try and put doctors and women in jail. Like these are not theories. These are actually things that are happening. They tend to happen to low-income women, Black and brown women, immigrant women who have less voice, but they're real. People hate that. People actually, that makes people turn away from what they can then determine as a control agenda and anti-choice values. And in fact, the polling shows that only 22% of self-identified Republicans agree with their own party's position on abortion. 22%. Think about that. That's Republicans. That's nothing to say about independents and Democrats. And that is the tool that we are leaving on the table when we don't lean into these arguments. So when I say that's our silence, the silence of the majority, was such an important part of their strategy, and for too long, we have engaged in that strategy, I mean it. And I don't just mean in talking about, I mean, again, all good things, talking about our own abortion, talking about the values, but really standing there and interrogating elected officials about, like, do you stand for this? What does this look like? Cory Booker did it great yesterday from the dais when in his opening statement. What is the end result of these policies? What does it look like for women and families, right? They should have to answer those questions. And when they do, we draw more people to our side, because our side is the one that shares the common values of freedom, equity, and justice.
Absolutely.
Can I go to Karen's question? Because
yes,
it's
I was just going to say, Karen also says, you mentioned dominion. Have you looked into dominionism, Pence, Barr, etc., as regards abortion? Free birth control plus sex education worldwide equal abortion becomes a true rarity.
So I think there are a couple things there. So Paul Weyrich, who we've talked about a little bit, who is probably one of the most influential people on the right most people have never heard of, and I didn't know much about him before we started actually researching the book, self-identified as a dominionist. And what that meant is it is a school of belief that God gave white Christian men dominion over all systems, certainly the family, but economic, social, and political systems. It is a divine right, and anyone who jeopardizes that, and we're hearing this a lot right now, is threatening religious liberty, right? Dominionism has for a long time been considered a school of thought that is so extreme you can't talk about it out loud. And in fact, there's a character in my book who came out of Ohio and in fact authored the first 6-week abortion ban in Ohio as far back as 2012 before they became super popular in 2019. And she was in fact cast off a public access radio service for self-identifying as a dominionist. Not coincidentally, actually completely ideologically coherently, she surfaced again as the spokesperson defending Roy Moore, who was running for Senate in Alabama as a known pedophile. And her argument was basically like, the Bible gave these men dominion, and actually it's important for them to have pure, like, it is really intense, right? And so I think we are seeing more evidence of people who do think of themselves as dominionists come out of the closet at this point. And I'm always like, bring it. Like, transparency is our friend. Lay your cards on the table, you know? But I do think that there is so much opportunity, untapped opportunity for all of, one of the reasons that the right and the GOP tries to focus attention on later abortion later in pregnancy, is precisely because they know that they both have no support for, early, like, first trimester abortion, but also because they go on offense when in fact their hypocrisy is something that we should lay out on the table. Why are more people needing to access abortion later in pregnancy? Because the massive amount of restrictions they have put into place have pushed these services out of reach until you can gather the money for transportation. You found childcare for the kids you already have. You can take time off your job. Every single day that goes by pushes you later in pregnancy, right? And that is their doing. And we need to make them own that. So every time they say the United States is one of the few countries that offers abortion later in pregnancy, it's important to say we will always have a need for abortion later in pregnancy. Things happen. It has to be accessible. And at the same time, all of those other countries make abortion as easy as humanly possible early in pregnancy, because that's the safest and the least, oppressive for women to be able to access. And they're trying to have it both ways. And that deflection and that gaslighting is so central to their ability to maintain their position. We've got to start calling them out on it.
Marge Signer says, it's so infuriating to hear Amy C. Barrett's religious liberty equal also about Hobby Lobby's religious liberty to deny coverage for birth control. How do we convince the public that we too, the pro-choice majority, have religious beliefs and moral positions, and our religious liberty counts?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Marge, and it's something that we spend an enormous amount of time thinking about. It's also something that I think extends beyond the reproductive freedom conversation. I think progressives have ceded the religious ground to our own detriment, especially when you have a right wing so grounded in, not just willing to, but grounded in using religion as a fig leaf for oppression, right? And Ted Cruz went on and on about that today from the dais and the hearings. And I was tweeting furiously, reminding people that, again, the first time they invoked religious liberty had to do with fighting school desegregation. The civil rights movement is the movement that actually won through really strong expression that people of all faiths and no faiths supported racial equality, right? And I think we need to learn a lot from that because the data bears that out. Whether you're talking about contraception or abortion access, people of all faiths absolutely support these rights. And we cannot shy away from that conversation. At the same time, I think it's really, really important. And I always say this as someone who was raised within the Jewish faith, the Jewish faith is really different on this than some of the Catholic doctrine. And there is a real risk and Mario Cuomo, actually, if you haven't read Mario Cuomo's speech at Notre Dame from 1984, I highly suggest you go back and read it, because one of the most crucial things he did was say, as a person who identified as pro-life, it was imperative that he rule in a manner that advanced reproductive freedom. And yes, that was because the outcomes, if you restricted these things, were bad for women and families, but it was because our democracy depends on everybody being able to personally practice their faith, but our governance has to be grounded in a fact-based public health outcome frame, or else we start to erode our democracy. And I think the fact that we don't have as many people carrying that mantle that Mario Cuomo did is showing up now in our trend towards authoritarianism. And let's be really clear, in every country that has trended towards fascism, authoritarianism, gender oppression was a core part of the manifestation of that strategy. So I cannot overstate how important it is that we call this out. I do think we're going to see a lot more of this, this sort of call of religious persecution by the right, because they do feel like Democrats are afraid to fight on that front. And I think we have to create broad coalitions that centralizes the idea that people of all faiths stand for these questions and these issues, and that we, Moral Mondays have been great for that, right? As Reverend Barber in North Carolina has expanded that coalition. And just really like claim the moral high ground and also call them out on there is nothing moral, there is nothing religious about separating families, about taking healthcare away from people, about forced sterilizations that are happening at ICE right now. We have got to lean into that, and that faithful people and people of good conscience who do not ascribe to a faith all stand in opposition to that.
I have a question for you, Ilyse. Given what's happening right now, the hearings for the Supreme Court Justice, we're hopeful that the outcome that we fear won't happen. But if it does, and Roe v. Wade does end up being overturned, then it will be back to individual states, will be the front line for abortion rights. Where do you have any thoughts on where that's might head?
So I would say a couple things about that I think are really important. I think that, I always say, and it sounds kind of funny, but it's absolutely true, that the right anti-choice movement does not actually march around carrying signs saying federalism now, send it back to the states, right? That is not their end goal. That is a nice way for elected officials to frame what's going to happen. Their end goal is actual, either a court decision or federal legislation that criminalizes abortion and actually establishes the idea that is grounded in religion and not science, that life begins at conception and all of the effects that has, including the moment a person becomes pregnant, having fewer rights than the fertilized egg that they're carrying. It's a terrifying concept, and that is their goal. That being said, I think that in many states, for many people, Roe is not real now, right? So we don't even have to sort of speculate. We see, we're seeing it here. Like, you're going to have to, abortion funds have had to expand. They used to just pay for the services. Right now they have to pay for travel, lodging, right? And so part of the strategy is, and I should say the triage strategy, if this becomes a reality, is to maintain islands of access. It was why it was so important to get the funding ban lifted in Illinois. Illinois is not just serving Illinois. Illinois is serving a sea of red all around it, where patients come into Illinois for abortion services. So those islands of access are incredibly important. We spent a lot of 2019 eradicating old laws on state books. A lot of states didn't even know they had pre-Roe criminalization laws on the books. So because Roe became the law of the land, a lot of states still had criminal statutes, including New York, by the way, and including Nevada, right? So we have been working actively on decriminalization laws, but even that's not enough. I think the next frontier is federal legislation that does three things: codifies Roe into statute. Yes, it will be sued, but that's okay. In addition to advancing federal legislation that has already been introduced, called the Women's Health Protection Act, which is a page out of the Voting Rights Act, which means that it would preempt a lot of the state restrictions, plus the Each Woman Act, which would repeal Hyde permanently and lift funding barriers. The three of those would go a long way towards establishing a new baseline. But ultimately, and this is where knowledge is power and understanding the history of the radical right is important, we are in the process as a movement, not just NARAL, with our partners, in looking at new forms of proactive state legislation that would ground the right to access abortion in fundamental constitutional rights like equality, and taking a page out of the marriage equality book and let's take it all to the Supreme Court and try one of our laws. And the last thing I will say, because it's really important, is that this court, even if this is the only court we have, it is subject to public opinion. That is why it's so important that we try these cases in the court of public opinion. A lot was made about the fact that the first abortion case to come before the Kavanaugh court broke our way 5-4. Kavanaugh was on the wrong side. Roberts left the conservatives and sided with the justices. I mean, sided with the liberal justices. He didn't do that because he wanted to do it. He did it because the legitimacy of the court is at stake. So we have to stay loud. We have to actually let them know that their legitimacy is at stake. And we have to have a really long overdue conversation about democracy reform, including court reform, because we have courts at all level in the federal judiciary, circuit, district, and Supreme Court, where over 25% of the judges have been appointed by this one president who didn't win the popular vote. That is inherently anti-democratic, and we have got to start to rebalance the courts.
Okay, I have one more question. This was a hot topic in Virginia last year because we were the final state needed to ratify the ERA. What is your thoughts? Will the ERA help in codifying reproductive freedom?
So there are lots of constitutional scholars who have looked at this. I don't think it would hurt. I think it would help. We have certainly had conversations with many of the folks who have put forward the ERA. I know there's concern about centralizing that too much because the right will come after us. And my answer to that is they're gonna come after us anyway. So we might as well actually gather the majority in support of this with every tool we have and say what we want. So I think the ERA is a crucially important step for a lot of reasons, but it would certainly advance the case that if women are equal under the law, that our ability to control our own bodies and our own lives is something that is less up for debate. So I think we're going to figure that out pretty soon.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to let you go. I know that you have a really busy schedule. Do you have any final thoughts, Ilyse?
No, just thank you for all that you have done and do. I was really impressed with the action items at the top of the hour. Individual action really matters. And one of the things that the right is trying to teach us, and Senator Mike Lee actually has said as much in the last couple of days, is that the minority should rule, right? He said that. And they try and teach us that our individual and collective actions don't matter. And they do that so that we will go away and stop trying. And I genuinely believe that nothing has ever mattered, but the belief that our own willingness to engage in collective action in pursuit of the highest ideals of collective justice, equity, and freedom will change the course of history. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you, Ilyse. So appreciate you being, I'm sure everyone would like to give you a virtual round of applause. We so appreciate you taking your precious time to be with us tonight.
Awesome.
Those of us who are local can stay on and get some more action items to do, but we'll let you go and get on with your evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kathy.
Can you get the slide up, Charlotte?
I sure can. Maybe. There we go.
Yay. Okay, well, as Charlotte said, yes, please take action. Buy Ilyse's book, support NARAL and the Blue Ridge Abortion Fund financially. But now that we're just 3 weeks away from Election Day, we have to make sure that the candidates that support the reproductive rights of women are elected up and down the ballot. As Charlotte said, if you have not already voted early, please do so if you are able. It is quick and safe. If not, be sure your absentee ballot is in the mail or delivered directly to the ballot boxes, both in downtown Charlottesville and at 5th Street in Albemarle County for the county. Plus, please contact any of these websites to see how you can help in the Get Out the Vote, the GOTV campaign that all of these groups are moving into. Virginia Victory is the coordinated campaign. They are doing literature drops and things. There's always phone banking, always texting, but where there are options to deliver candidate literature and voting information to people we know have not yet voted. We do keep track of who's voted and who hasn't, so we can target those people to get them to the polls. Seville Dems are looking for people to staff their table at the early voting center. Albemarle Dems are looking to staff locations for Get Out the Vote. The web campaign is delivering literature every Saturday and Sunday from now until Election Day. So if you sign, we have the coordinated campaign, the website's there for VA Victory, Virginia Victory, the Seville Dems, the Albemarle Dems, then Dr. Webb's campaign, and Mark Warner's campaign. So please access those. There's something for everybody to suit everybody's skills. It's so important that we get the people to the polls to vote for the candidates who support our issues. So thanks, Charlotte.
Thanks everybody for your time. Hope to see you at our next event.